Thanks a lot, Alison, and thanks, Brian. I do a little bit of teaching in addition to what Alison has said about me, and I teach at Boston University every summer. And most recently, I started out teaching about pit latrines and stuff like that. It was called environmental health. And I wondered why I was coming to teach chief medical officers and that bunch, 70 senior policymakers from around the developing world about this kind of stuff. And observers from BU in my class recognized that my energy level dropped when I talked about those issues, but it rose when I talked about assets and sustainable livelihoods and policy challenges. And so over the years, that evolved. And what you heard from Brian was exactly the first lecture that I give at BU every year. So thanks, Brian.
I wish you'd given it to me, because it saved me some time.
So I go through the decades of international development and why they failed, and the little successes they had, and why this has led us to where we are. But that has been done for you. I took my task this morning in two ways from what Alison had told us prior to coming here, and that is that we should listen and reflect on what we have heard and use that, share that with you in a very brief way, and then try to chart an agenda forward, including a policy agenda. So let me try to do that with you. What I heard over the last few days was two broad things. One set was brilliant oratory and inspiring rhetoric. But I also heard some concrete case studies and concrete ideas for action. If I summarize the last bit, so I'm going to leave the inspiring and brilliant oratory part, and I'm going to move to the concrete part. The concrete ideas that I have heard, I believe, can be summarized in the following 4 or 5 steps, which I believe can constitute an operational methodology which would link assets to sustainable livelihood outcomes, and do it in a minute. And this is what I would suggest is an action plan for that. You start with a vision. You facilitate a vision with the community of where they want to go, step 1. Step 2, you do an inventory of the assets of that community. And because they had a vision, the assets then begin to make sense. I would argue that you cannot understand the full asset base until you relate it to some vision. Otherwise, you wouldn't even know what assets are relevant, and so on. The third step, I would say, is very important, that we then establish what the community can do on its own to get where it wants to go. And only then figure out what outsiders' role is. And then it comes out naturally, and we don't have to have, in my mind, a one-day seminar on what is the role of outsiders. It will come naturally after you have done the vision, the asset base, what local people can do for themselves, and then what outsiders can do. And that role of outsiders is a tricky one, as we all know, because sometimes the role of the outsider is not the role of those outsiders who are present at that point of time. It might be a different set of outsiders, and you've got to be humble enough to accept that when you facilitate that, it's not you who might be able to help the community at that point, but another set of outsiders with whom you have to partner or bring into the equation. Because that role might be policy, that role might be finance, it might be credit, it might be information, it might be technology, it might be institutional change. It can be a whole range of things. So that, in summary, I believe, are the concrete ideas that I will put in a simple framework, and now we can get to work. Of course, we have heard all about evaluation and monitoring. You know when to do it, how much to spend, how much not to spend, and when not to do it, so I won't go into that. Let me just say that in my own experience, thinking about about assets and livelihoods or community economic development or local economic development or poverty reduction, whatever your goal is, it can be applied in very different ways, and we have to be very pragmatic with our entry points and not be dogmatic about them. And the entry points, we have to really look, and you can find them. I have been able to do this work, for example, in Egypt with physical planners. These physical planners never thought about communities. They never thought about people. They were engineers so-and-so and doctors so-and-so, but yet no people involved in this thing. So Jody and I decided to go on a jaunt, so we went up to Egypt. And we ran a training course. Jody was there for some of the time, and I continued. And then we went to the field in Farafra in the Oasis, took 25 planners out. And at the end of a 2 or 3 month interaction with them, the chairman of the General Organization for Physical Planning called me and he said, this organization will forever now put people into the planning process. I was delighted. It happened even in Egypt. It can happen anywhere. Let me move now, and I don't have time. I have done this in at least 25 to 30 different countries around the world in at least 100 or more contexts. So all I'm saying is look for a pragmatic, opportunistic entry point as you proceed. We have documented this in the literature. It's on the web. We did a book called Sustainable Livelihoods, Building on the Wealth of the Poor. That's available as well, so you can read the stories if you're interested. Let me now move to some other more policy-type issues and then try to set an agenda on the way forward. Let me start with one of John's points that really struck me when he spoke, John McKnight, the first day, when he said, government, corporations, and academics are obstacles to our work. I don't want to take John out of context. I know him and I love him and his work. But I did hear that clearly. And that was intriguing for me to hear. I work for government, as you know. I have many friends in corporations, and I spend some time teaching in universities. So I look like the embodiment of obstacles. And then I heard Mary's point, and this seminar that we are doing, I understand, is a joint effort between Cody and ABCD. So let me pick on John and pick on Mary. And Mary said, one community at a time. We will do this one community at a time. And I wondered, and I said, well, that's one way to approach it. Woof. And I'm thinking about my great-grandchildren, children, and the world becoming a better place. And maybe that's the only way to do it. According to Brian, everything else has failed. Well, it's kind of scary if that's the way we will do it. So I suspect that we might have to look at some policy, institutional linkages, and some levers that will help to speed up our work a little bit. So let me talk a little bit about these policy and institutional linkages and where I believe this will go. Now, if you don't mind, I will focus the rest of my remainder of my remarks more on the developing country issues. I have worked in the US and Canada on these issues as well, but I've done much, much more work in the developing world, and I'm more comfortable referring to them. That's one reason. The other reason is, in my mind, we have had a disproportionate focus on North America in our 3 days compared to the amount of attention that the developing world has had. So I will try to do a little balancing act in a way to try to give some emphasis to that. And so point one is the context of the community with which we work. When we work with a community that sits in an island a community that sits in a sea of wealth and support, it's a very different context, and that I would argue is the context of North America.